Saudi Arabia is set to host the men's 2034 World Cup after Australia decided against bidding to stage the tournament. Let's find out a bit more about that with talkSPORT Saudi football correspondent Ben Jacobs joins us. Hello, Ben. How are you?
Good afternoon, gents. How are you?
We're good. Happy Halloween, if that's the thing. Listen, lots to talk to you about. But firstly, can you tell us a bit about the bidding process and why Australia now decided to drop out?
Yeah, I think Halloween is a thing, by the way, which is why I've come dressed as a pumpkin. For those of you watching online, you'll see that I've got Halloween coloured shirts. But as far as today's colour is concerned, it is green in Saudi Arabia. And as you rightly say, they're now the hot favourites to host the 2034 World Cup. It's seemingly a formality because they're the only country that has declared a bid. And what we know is that it's a single country bid. They won't be partnering with anybody. And Australia say they've pulled out because they're exploring other opportunities. But what Saudi have done well in the last few months is gain support, particularly in Asia and Africa, a few in South America. And I think when Australia assessed the landscape, even though they hosted a very successful Women's World Cup along with New Zealand, they realised that the votes just weren't there. So Saudi Arabia now still have to go through the bidding process. It's not categorically confirmed that it's a Winter World Cup, but given that Qatar was moved on health grounds, it's highly likely that it will be a Winter World Cup. And as a consequence, Saudi Arabia have now got a long run up in order to tie this World Cup into the Saudi Pro League and into this so-called Vision 2030 as well, which is all about bringing sport to Saudi Arabia and promoting a healthy lifestyle.
So then what was FIFA's motivation, do you think, then, to hold the 2034 World Cup in Asia or Oceania?
Well, I think it is about Saudi Arabia and the project. We shouldn't be naive about this. Of course, we can talk about all of the positives in Saudi Arabia on the sports side, promoting grassroots sport, having a legacy. Qatar obviously touched upon many of the same topics, but by the same token, Saudi Arabia were there off the back of Qatar. And that was a big motivation for them, seeing their smaller brother, if you like, or their noisy neighbour, to use a Manchester United, Manchester City term, having the first World Cup in the Middle East. And off the back of that, I think FIFA realised that the centenary World Cup 4 years earlier will obviously factor in both Europe and South America. So it was logical to offer a World Cup to potentially on Australia. That might have been in their thinking, but more so Saudi Arabia and their ambition to have this tournament. And I think as soon as the invite was out there that it was Oceania and the Middle East, potentially North Africa as well, because Egypt were spoken about in terms of maybe partnering at one point. But as soon as it was clear that it was going to be Middle East, it was only ever going to be Saudi Arabia. And the ambition, the money, the overall sports strategy put Saudi Arabia in a position where they were always likely to win this thing. And now it's not definite because there'll be some bidding logistics to go through, but because they are ultimately unopposed, I think we can say at this point that Saudi Arabia are going to host the World Cup in 2034.
How do you think this will go down with the fans, the football fans?
Well, I think better than you might think, only because Qatar's been. And if this was the first in the Middle East, we would get the same headlines and scrutiny. And they should still be there, obviously, because there's areas that Saudi Arabia will want to improve and use sport in order to do that. But if you remember when Qatar got the bid, it was, how can you stage it in the desert? How can you stage it in the heat? Is it safe? Will effectively one country, but really in the case of Qatar, one city World Cup work? It's very hard to make those arguments off the back of Qatar, because if you're judging Qatar in football terms, in logistical terms, it was very successful. If you're judging it based on cost to the fans, if you're judging it based on inclusion, if you're factoring in human rights and legacy, then Qatar obviously still has some work to do, and Saudi Arabia will no doubt come under the same kind of scrutiny. But I think that we won't quite have the same agenda because it's not the first in the Middle East. And as a result, even those that maybe didn't like moving a World Cup from summer to winter might be more okay with it now because it's not the first.
Ben, do you think this is one step closer again to Saudi Arabia almost like taking over the world of sport? Because we've already seen it with the golf. They've now got the Saudi Pro League where a lot of obviously high profile players are playing over there. We've seen it with the boxing. They're getting all the big boxing events. Is this just one step closer to them taking over all sports?
Yeah, I think so. And I think with a World Cup, it's ultimately a vote. And the Saudis can always argue, unlike Qatar, that they were unopposed. The reason for that, like I say, is because they did a lot of their vote winning beforehand. And the pitch was seemingly strong, at least verbally, to get these countries on board. But a World Cup is about declaring. And if you're unopposed, then nobody can necessarily say that there was a more worthy winner because Australia have backed out. With the other sports you mentioned, it's a bit different because money can talk there. You get in with the leagues, you get in with individual players. Live Golf is one example of a splinter tour that has now merged commercially with the PGA. We know that boxing has come over there, as you alluded to. There's the growth of the Saudi Pro League. So the World Cup's the icing on the cake, and everything that Saudi Arabia do between now and the 2034 World Cup becomes a whole lot easier because they've got a focal point. They'll get funding infrastructure-wise to build new stadiums and redevelop them, and that will help them host other sports. So there's a connectivity. But at the sports level, when you want individual events or players, you can go out there and dominate just with money. With a World Cup, it's a slightly different process, but they obviously are linked.
Let me ask you about the crowds they're getting for the Saudi Pro League, because from what I'm reading and what I'm seeing on the telly, it's been a flop so far because you're getting 650, 700 people going to watch games where, for argument's sake, Jordan Henderson is playing. Do you think this is a problem, or because it's a World Cup, that won't come into it whatsoever?
Well, Saudi Arabia have always had big teams in Riyadh and Jeddah, and those outside have been a little bit smaller. And Steven Gerrard's Al Ittifaq are going to be moving into a new stadium. It's very possibly in Dammam going to be one of the World Cup venues. So everyone's trying for growth. And it's absolutely true what you say about Jordan Henderson playing in an away game, we should say, in front of a crowd of under 700. But if you look, for example, last season before Henderson joined, same game, the attendance was 350. So you can argue this two ways.
I think there's only one way to argue it. 350 to 700 is still embarrassing with the amount of money they've put into that league. There's no other way of looking at that.
I don't think you're going to get a smaller team in Saudi that always had less than 1,000 jumping to 10,000 overnight. So if it's a 50% increase, it's not a bad stat. But again, it's an away game. But you're absolutely right in what you say, that is a poor number. However, if you look at Al Hilal, they're filling their national team stadium with 60,000. So there's just a big volume of fans that support very specific big teams. And the smaller teams in Saudi have, as you rightly say, got a lot of work to do.
Okay. All right. Well, listen, thanks so much for coming on. And
thanks,
we
Ben.
shall catch up with you again soon.
Cheers, guys. All the best.
Thanks, pal. There you go. Ben Jacobs, talkSPORT Saudi correspondent. What do you make of that, the World Cup coming to... Saudi
for me, it's just it's again another step closer to the domination we saw with the golf. We're now seeing the biggest boxing events in the world go to Saudi, the Saudi Pro League. Now they've got the World Cup. I'm pretty sure the Olympics won't be that far off.
talkSPORT Drive with Andy Goldstein, Monday to Friday afternoon from 4 on AM, on DAB, via the talkSPORT app and on your smart speaker. talkSPORT.